They didn't have a universal calendar back then. So you couldn't say, like we can today with the Gregorian calendar, in the year 2019 or something like that. Instead, they would indicate a year that something happened by saying the number of years that somebody had been in power. In the case of Luke and the start of Jesus' ministry, it was the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius. Now, Tiberius was the Roman emperor, and he had ruled from 14 to 37 AD. But he had also been the regional leader in that particular area, starting in the year 12. So this gives us an effective range of 27 to 29 AD, and that kind of range is actually really precise for ancient history. He also mentions some of the regional local kings, and they don't particularly matter for the story, except for Herod. That would be Herod Antipas, one of the sons of Herod the Great, who meets Jesus face to face once, and he was also the guy that gets John the Baptist beheaded. But another very interesting little detail that Luke slips in there is when he says that this is during the uh, priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. Now, that's actually incorrect in the sense that the high priesthood is a lot like Highlander. At any given time, there can only be one. So, did Luke just get this wrong? Well, as it turns out, that it seems like Luke is being particularly subversive. See, Jesus is going to die because of basically Caiaphas, because it was Caiaphas who was the high priest that year. But a little look at history, we learn that Annas was the one controlling the high priesthood for a long time. It's no coincidence that the high priests during the life and career of Annas tended to be related to Annas. He's like this shadowy figure controlling the high priesthood at the temple in Jerusalem. And whoever controls the temple in Jerusalem, as empires learned over time, controls the Jewish people. So he's this guy in the background controlling everything, and Caiaphas, Anna's son in law, is currently the one who gets to pretend to be in charge. So Luke is sneaking that detail in there, and we'll talk about Caiaphas a lot later as we get closer to the execution of Jesus. But anyway, Luke then explains that the word of the Lord comes to John the Baptist. And you don't get any more prophetic than this. That's actually a formula that you'll find in the Old Testament. The word of the Lord comes to somebody, and then that somebody, just by definition, becomes a prophet. So he immediately sets John the Baptist up as this wild prophetic figure proclaiming from the deserts that God is doing something. And Luke, to set this point even further, actually mentions the book of Isaiah. Now, that quote mostly comes from chapter 40. And we're going to learn also throughout this series that whenever the New Testament quotes the Old Testament, it's very complicated. Ancient Jewish scholars or rabbis would often take passages from the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible and mix things together, or they would assume that the people reading or hearing would know the whole backstory and context. So it'll get tricky as we try to decipher things. But anyway, the point being that for Luke to draw from Isaiah 40 is critical because Isaiah 39 is all about exile. You see, God's covenant people, the people who lived in Judah, were sent away to Babylon in exile, ultimately by the year 586, because they had violated God's covenant over and over again. And when I say violate God's covenant, I don't mean like they accidentally ate bacon on a Sunday morning or something like that. They kept worshiping other gods to the point that they actually sacrificed children to Canaanite gods. So this is a big deal. So God removes his people from the land that he promised to give them because they violated the covenant. And they ended up in Babylon. And now we learn that eventually they were able to return, and this started in the year 537 BC. And at that time, they were allowed to start rebuilding their temple, and you can read all about that in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But here's the thing. Even though they were allowed to return from exile, they were still in exile. They spent those hundreds of years from 537 BC up to Jesus' own day and then beyond under the boot of a foreign empire. They didn't get to be free. They still had to pay taxes to foreign pagan empires. So there was this sense, this very frustrating sense, that the Jewish people were never free. They were still in exile, still being punished for their sins and the sins of their forefathers. So that raised this question. When God finally acts, will they then be free from these foreign oppressors? Now, basically everybody answered yes. They all disagreed on what exactly that was going to look like. But imagine this scene. You're one of these Jewish peasants. You hear about this fiery preacher, and he is announcing that God is doing what he promised to do, that he is making the way for the kingdom of God. And people are murmuring, Isaiah 40, which they probably would have known by heart. And this John the Baptist is saying prophet things and he's doing prophet things. So there's this expectation that, well, if God is finally doing what God promised he was going to do, well, one, what do we do now? And two, is this the guy that's going to do it?